welcome back. We have a great Trinity 10 lined up. But today we'll start a session with Professor Saul Smilansky, professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Haifa, Israel, who will be presenting the paper, Is There a Right to be Deterred? As usual, the format will be more or less 30 minutes of presentation, and then we'll follow it up with questions. Over to you.
Okay, very good. Right, thank you for coming. We reached double figures, so thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Particularly during the first week and all those other things going on. So I hope you won't be terribly sorry. Okay. Maybe I'll say a few words about myself. I go a long way in Oxford. I actually did my DPhil here at Magdalen like a few hundred years ago, and This is a paper, a distinct paper, specific paper, but it's part of a big project of mine that I'm working on that I call Crazy Ethics. So I'm completing a book called Crazy Ethics, which is roughly the idea that assuming mathematically that morality makes sense, that it's not just completely socially relative or subjective or bullshit, whatever, then nevertheless, the content of morality as we understand it today is questionable. So that with the reasons, for serious reasons, not about everything, but about a lot of stuff, and that actually true morality, or at least the things that seem to make sense to us, are, if we look carefully, are full of what I call the three P's, I mean, perplexities and paradoxes and perversions. And so this is like a big project I'm trying to complete a book on. And this is one example. Not the worst example. Yeah. Some are even more outrageous. But anyway, so that's fine. And in general, I'm here for the rest of the term until July. So if anybody, just look me up if anybody's interested in pursuing this, or indeed anything else. Okay, good. Okay, is there a right to be deterred? The notion of a right to be deterred, henceforth RTBD, from wrongdoing has not, to the best of my knowledge, ever been seriously considered, and clearly there is no thorough philosophical discussion of it. If there is indeed a moral right to be deterred, it remains morally, socially, and legally unrecognized as such. The right to be deterred seems an obvious non-starter and indeed quite absurd. Not in the sense that absurd, not in the sense I used before, but in the sense that seems to be a problem. Not having been deterred cannot be a moral or legal excuse for wrongdoing, at least for sane adults. But you didn't deter me does not seem like a plausible moral complaint from an offender. An expectation for the creation of, say, total deterrence for all crime on the social level would be both unfeasible and highly dangerous. And being deterred typically involves fearing the sanctions of others. A right to have such fears created and enhanced, let alone having the sanctions executed upon one if the fears created were not sufficiently deterring, seems particularly odd. I argue, however, that to some extent a right to be deterred exists, and people can be wronged by its not being respected. So basically, I'm going to try to make the case for the existence of this unrecognized right, and face some control, open up and take up some objections, but not really work on that question. Well, if it exists, how to determine when and the extent of it, what happens in conflict situations, and how it confronts what happens when it confronts other rights. I mean, it's much too early for this. I'm basically going to try to make the case. I speak here of rights in a conventional way and take them to be something like the principled moral and legal entitlements of persons. If people have a right to be deterred, they have a valid claim that considerable efforts be made to deter them. This claim is basically based upon their interest. The famous Raz definition, X has a right if X can have rights and other things being equal, an aspect of X's well-being, his interest, is a sufficient reason for holding some other persons to be under a duty. The terms can be understood in common sense terms again, as discouraging actions through the threat of sanctions. So I'm not laying any, there's no tricks here. It's just, the conclusion is problematic, of course, but hopefully you'll think interesting. But I'm not playing games with the definition of the terms or the definition of right or something. I'm staying on a conventional area, sphere. Right to be deterred can be taken to be roughly the claim that there is often a strong pro tanto moral case requiring the creation of a situation whereby a category of persons will be regularly deterred by being given self-interested motivation based upon credible threats not to commit wrongs of certain types or in certain situations. And two, this moral case need to be understood, at least in part, as deriving from the right of the potential wrongdoers. As with other rights, the right to be deterred poses corresponding obligations on certain others. It is a claim right, be they family members, organizations, or society as a whole. I'll give examples later on in ways that we shall begin to explore. My claim is that there is, in certain circumscribed ways, a strong moral case for recognizing a right to be deterred as a justified moral norm. This assumes that a certain level of deterrence can be effective concerning many people and that is likely to be room for improvement, and does not apply when deterrence is bound to be fail or make things worse. Now, of course, there's a lot to be said here about when deterrence, and what types of deterrence, and what alternatives to deterrence is this. And of course, usually we should, not always, but usually we should look for other alternatives to deterrence, etc. So all that I take as given, but I assume that, and the bottom line at the end of the day, we're going to have to, I mean, most people, to some extent, and some people to a much greater extent, will need to be actually deterred by the threat of punishment. It is not just that there is some interest in being deterred, dependent on other fundamental interests, such as not having one's freedom taken in imprisonment as a derivative right. Rather, my claim is that there is a fundamental interest in not having to confront social situations when one is constantly tempted to do wrong, where one is, as it were, led into badness, even if one as an agent also plays a role. This is not to deny other social possibilities besides deterrence. You could be rationally dissuaded from doing wrong, or being distracted from doing wrong, or being protected from exposure to conditions ripe for wrongdoing, or even being forcibly prevented from acting wrongly. But my focus is on those common instances when deterrence is crucial, since other possibilities do not apply or we would not want them to apply. I'm not merely defending the claim that it would be socially better by and large if there were general deterrent policies in place, i.e. something like a rules consequentialist argument for deterrence. My claim is focused on individuals who get wronged by their society if their right for a reasonable measure of deterrence is not respected. This then leads to an individual right to be deterred. Arguably, angels have no right to be deterred, although I'm not an expert on angel studies. Being of their very nature morally perfect beings, they are not tempted to do wrong and need no assistance in avoiding it. Human beings, however, are not angels, and that is the starting point for my argument. An environment of unencumbered temptation for wrongdoing, where whatever one does, no sanctions will apply, can be very destructive. It will naturally lead to instances of wrongdoing. That already in itself will be bad for people, assuming that doing wrong is pro tanto a bad feature of one's life. It can, and of course, there's many examples of thought, and we don't need to have a specific theory in mind, Socratic or otherwise. But I think that this is common sense, really. I mean, everything here in the paper is common sense except what the result is, which is this really weird right. It can also be expected that constantly falling into temptation to do wrong, with few countervailing concerns, is likely to lead to actual self-harm. Freedom and the sense of freedom are, of course, very important, but operating without constraints is likely to lead to irresponsible choices, thereby directly harming oneself and, in any case, wronging others in a way that will lead to consequent harm as a response from others, at least sometimes. We will focus mostly on legal offending, but the right to be deterrent is part of a larger background where the absence of adequate deterrence leads to preventable wrongdoing, which is morally significant. In such situations, it will often be the case that the person's interests would clearly have been furthered had she been deterred. It is, as a rule, better to live in an environment providing some deterrence, just as it is better not to live in a Hobbesian state of nature. The concerns here are fundamental. But even if that is granted, why would it generate any sort of right to be deterred? We can begin to see this by thinking about the role of parents. Parents have various obligations with regard to their children. Children have a right to be fed, sheltered, and protected in various ways. Parents who consistently fail in setting limits for their children in ways which inherently involve an element of explicit or implicit deterrence can be said to be negligent in their duties. Rights typically aim to give us security from the authorities, the interventions of others, or extreme hardship. The right to be deterred also gives us, as we shall see, a similar sort of security in somewhat paradoxical form. One way in which we might see the salience of the idea of a right to be deterred is through situations where, in the absence of the relevant deterrence, we ourselves could not perhaps be trusted. Speeding situations seem widely relevant. I think, for most people, certainly for me, but imagine most people. If you when you see a policeman ahead on the road, that people slow down, and if you were guaranteed that there isn't an or something, then you would take more risks, especially when you're in a hurry, or it's just sometimes fun to drive quickly or whatever. So I think that's something I don't think anybody. I think most people are not potential serious criminals or rapists, etc., whatever. But I think in certain issues, I give kind of example in the middle. You see later. Bank tellers, etc. So I think that very few of us, if any, indeed, can live well without deterrence, which makes it, I think, a fundamental right. Right. It might be counted that the interest being protected by deterrence here is not some individual interest in being deterred, but our universal interest in safety and bodily integrity, which require that others drive safely, in this example, for example. But there's no reason not to acknowledge both perspectives. Overspeeding indeed generates social practices aimed at discouraging through threats of sanction. But once this is taken as a given, potential overspeeders have interests in, at the very least, not being punished for overspeeding. I think we also have an interest in not running over people. But in any case, not being punished for overspeeding. And this requires that they be given adequate motivating deterrence through viable threats. This is seen even more clearly when we move on to crime that involves severe punishment. It is prima facie better, in narrower self-interested terms, not to be caught if committing a crime. But it is better to be deterred from committing the crime rather than committing it and then being caught and punished, at least under some normal, typical circumstances. So in game theoretic terms, even for potential criminals' narrow self-interest, the priority schematically ought typically to be seen as follows. 1, to commit crimes, not be caught, and avoid a severe prison sentence. 2, to be deterred, not commit crimes, and avoid a severe prison sentence. And 3, to commit crimes, be caught, and end up with a severe prison sentence, which is obviously the worst. Even if 1 is greater than 2, so to commit a crime and not be caught is better than to be deterred under circumstances. It is the 1 is better than 1 in 2. Then 2 is still greater than 3. And given certain plausible and realistic conditions that generate the relevant probabilities, the likelihood of 3 over 1, committing a crime, being caught, and ending up with a severe prison sentence, if you commit at least a series of crimes, the likelihood of that over 1, which is again to commit a crime and not be caught, makes deterrence too an advantage to many potential criminals. This is the foundation for my claim about a right to be deterred in the sphere of criminal justice. We owe it to potential victims of crime that we discourage the attractiveness of 1, i.e. that the probability of 1 be relatively small. So this is the familiar argument. My argument is the following one. And my claim is that we also independently owe it to potential criminals, not only to the victims, but to potential criminals themselves, that the probability of 2 be high. That is, that they be deterred. Okay, we are at 5.3. We focus here on the right to be deterred from committing genuine wrongs from which one ought to be deterred, such as engaging in crimes. We set aside some transgressions that ought not to be of concern to the law, adultery because of individual autonomy or privacy, or transgressions that ought not to be sanctioned, such as legitimate protest against the government. And we shall assume that unless intentionally transgressing, the person threatened will not confront the implementation of the threat. So we will not concern ourselves with the punishment of the innocent here. Yeah, life as hard as it is, just try to avoid whatever you can. Cheat when you can. That's a basic rule of moral philosophy. Another way to see the case for the right to be deterred would be as follows. It is commonly believed that the sanctions for transgression should be clearly known in advance. It seems natural to say that people have a right to know what to expect if they do wrongly, and rendering the sanctions thus transparent is also a major means of deterrence. But by extension, it seems that the right is not only to know what the expected sanction can be, but it be there as a known, dependable, threatening factor that can seriously motivate people's decision making. The availability and dependability of the threat seem on par with knowing about the relevant sanctions. It is not merely a matter of procedural justice, but of fairness and reasonable expectations. But then the fallback of the terms would be punishment when threats are not heeded. Here matters begin to get particularly interesting. For the threat of severe punishment and its implementation if the threat was not successful in a particular case is not posed on the basis of vengeful or otherwise retribution based thoughts about the positive goodness of criminals paying a heavy price for their crimes. I mean, there might be a specific case for that, but that's not the base of my argument. Rather, the thought here is that the threat of harsh punishment and the consequent actualization of the threat if it has failed to deter are welcome based upon the general idea that the criminals themselves have a right to be deterred. The basic idea here needs to be distinguished from two others with which it may be confused. First, some have argued that wrongdoers have a right to be punished, primarily have the right to be punished, primarily as a way of respecting them as persons and moral agents. More is this familiar argument, the intuition is Kantian, of course. I, however, am speaking about a right that potential criminals have, but see it as a right to be deterred, rather than a right to be punished if not deterred. While one can support both a right to be punished and a right to be deterred, the ideas are very different, and one can adopt one but not the other. Second, Warren Quinn has put society's right to threaten potential criminals as fundamental, and the social permission to actually punish as merely derivative in order to make the threat sustainable. However, the view I am putting forward sees threats as a way of deterring potential criminals to be indeed fundamental, but attaches this right to the potential criminal, him or herself, rather than to society. So, but the focus of the paper here, and almost in general, I mean, that's one of my faults. I mean, in general, my moral philosophy is quite individualistic. Consciousness of the social background for crime typically raises the idea that punishment and ipso facto the threat of punishment ought to be lowered because this social background mitigates the responsibility of the criminals. The right to be deterred, by contrast, and here things, this, I mean, when I promised you some crazy ethics, I mean, that's things are starting here. We're moving into high gear here. The right to be deterred, by contrast, often implies that society is faulty for under-deterring, not meeting in that way the rights of those who will commit crimes and will then be punished to have been more effectively deterred. Then, paradoxically, these people were victims of society, but in a new sense, in a way, whose rights to be deterred were unjustifiably neglected. All this is not to deny the practical and ethical importance of social efforts to confront unfortunate social crime-enhancing factors such as poverty. But accepting all that, and assuming that there will still be temptations for some to engage in crime, there is a need for threats deterring through the criminal justice system. No realistic social conditions can totally eliminate the right to be deterred because humans tend to be in need of some deterrence. Recall the speeding example. On the other hand, societies can create social conditions where most people grow up to be fairly responsible and decent, so that only a minimal level of deterrence then needs to be in place. In less well-formed societies, the right to be deterred will have stronger and often more problematic implications. The right is to protect the agents against themselves, as it were, against their fallen part. Yet, in another way, we can see that on reflection, the right to be deterred is well within the frameworks of rights that protect features of agency. I mean, the basic argument here, I may spell it out in the longer paper, is basically that if you have the foundations which include deterrence, then you can exercise your agency more freely and more dependently and be responsible. And then you will be granted more freedom and agency, respect for your agency. It will be indeed often been clear how to calculate the level of deterrence needed or most desirable. Those are issues of immense complexity. This has been recognized at least since Bentham. Our focus again is on the preliminary issue of the very idea that there is a right to be deterred, and indeed I have no expertise on. reason to trust my intuitions necessarily on the level of deterrence that would be actually needed in different social contexts. A right to be deterred along such lines then raises other concerns, such as with justice and indeed opposing rights, and these would often require that we harm people's right to be deterred. Again, we are in crazy territory here. I mean, just note here that the injustice here is not being unjustly punished, but the injustice, although that may be included here, but the injustice here would be that you were not sufficiently deterred for other reasons. I mean, for example, I'll give some examples, but society was skimping on money and whatever, and then they did not respect your right to be more seriously deterred. And that is the injustice. Okay? So there's a reverse here of the usual intuitions. A right to be deterred. In 10.3. In terms of fairness and justice, we might interpret the right to be deterred as something like a right not to be punished if one wasn't confronted with serious attempts at deterrent first. What serious means here would, of course, vary, but usually might refer to deterring measures that are widely effective concerning most comparable people. Perhaps this can even be interpreted as a thick sense of having a fair opportunity to avoid criminal sanction. Familiar view from Hart, who probably spent a lot of time in this room. If a serious effort to deter one was not implemented, perhaps we should conclude that such a fair opportunity was not given. It can be said that society typically has a pro tanto duty to attempt to deter before you punish. So part of the understanding of this right follows from that. And this follows from the fact, I mean, at least my claim is that it follows from the fact that we do punish. If we're going to punish, we should at least make a serious attempt to deter, because we're going to punish. In terms of the seriousness with which the right to be deterred is to be taken, this might be something like a right that the deterrence owed to potential offenders be a significant consideration when establishing policy with the sort of moral weight that being a right involves. So the right to be deterred needs to be an independent consideration, with countervailing weight when confronting other considerations such as justice, mitigating circumstances, financial costs, and so on. The implications here would cut across traditional ideological and political borders. I'm putting the volume up here. Of the craziness. If the right to be deterred from committing street crime is in fact harmed because of limited police presence, which is too low to deter many people who would otherwise have avoided wrongdoing in the ensuing sanctions, this will apply both to jurisdictions which skimp on financing such a presence for reasons of right-wing aversion to taxation, and to the jurisdictions motivated by progressive aims to defund the police. Both may equally harm the rights of people to be deterred. Some further support for a right to be deterred can be seen from the idea of entrapment, which is widely thought to be morally odious. Entrapment, since it involves the intentional presentation of temptations to do wrong, lies at the opposite end from the measures implementing a right to be deterred. But my claim is that for many people, in many contexts, situations of extreme under-deterrence may be similar to entrapment. So arguably, many social circumstances, most social conditions, particularly for poor people, and in facing hardship, etc., they might be said to be metaphorically entrapped by their society. And the right to be deterred argues on the other side. It is a right to be deterred not inherently paternalistic. I think that here we must admit it has such an aspect, and indeed this was indicated when presenting the rationale for it. That society is about to punish transgressors who are not deterred and are caught, this itself helps to make a strong case for the claim that society has a considerable obligation to try and deter such transgressors and save them from being punished by itself. Moreover, establishing an adequate order of threats will often involve lesser paternalism than forcibly preventing potential criminals from wrongdoing, or technologically intrusive surveillance, or directly agency affecting invasive manipulative interventions. For the autonomy and responsibility of the potential wrongdoer is respected if we just heighten the deterrence. There is an interesting, at least up to a limit, there's an interesting general question as to when something that is favorable or helpful to people becomes a right. This is a complex issue and lies beyond our scope. For our purposes, it suffices that at least sometimes we can see the idea of a right to be deterred as being valid. People typically have fundamental interest in confronting some habitual deterrence. Moreover, such obligations follow not only from the difficulties that many of the potential people will face in behaving normatively without deterrence and in their great interest in being guided towards normative behavior, but in the role and obligations of those who can provide the deterrence. Parents, as we saw, are responsible for bringing up their children and helping them to learn to avoid mischief. Police departments put people into positions of authority, which regularly involve the temptation of the misuse of power, and need to counter these with some credible threats towards the policemen and women so as to deter such misuse by policemen and policewomen. And society as a whole has some, in the last stretch, responsibility towards potential transgressors beyond the general obligation to protect and help its members, both because it plays a role in forming them and, as we saw, because it proposes to harm them if they are not deterred. So even if banks can tolerate some measure of teller deceitfulness, they may have a duty to provide a certain level of deterrence beyond their commercial interests and even the social good because of the temptations provided to their workers, which handle a lot of money all the time, which need to be supported by knowing that there is supervision, i.e., because they have a right to be deterred. How do I know if my right to be deterred has been violated? Now here things become tricky. If I committed wrong, is that sufficient to show that my right to be deterred was violated since I obviously wasn't deterred? Doesn't that mean that whether A violated B's rights is determined not by A's actions, but by B's choices? That is at odds with thinking of B's rights as a constraint on A's actions. The difficulty must be admitted, but also shows the particular novelty and interest of a right to be deterred. One way to go here would be to say, as before, that a person's right to be deterred is violated if society has not made a serious attempt to deter him or her. What a serious attempt is would depend on balancing manifold considerations and vary contextually, but none of this threatens the basic idea of a right to be deterred. Skepticism about free will and moral responsibility will, of course, make a difference here, and my argument will seem that these notions make sense. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this in discussion. Done quite a bit of work on free will. So, okay, we can see how that one falls. Okay, it might be argued that the right to be deterred would imply the notion of success in being deterred. One would then have a duty to succeed in deterring others, which seems implausible. But the right to be deterred is more subtle. It is broadly the right that a serious effort, as I said before, be made to deter one or people like one. And this is something that most people can reasonably expect from their parents, the bank they work for, or society as a whole. How strong or broad is the right to be deterred? Would it be appropriate to speak about it as an unrecognized but fundamental human right? The importance of this right pushes us in that direction. Considering this would require that we address difficult issues which go beyond the scope of the present discussion. It would suffice at this stage that we recognize that there is a right to be deterred and that there is an important right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.